They thought the pressure would crack your foundation. They thought your compliance was just delayed surrender. They thought the weight they designed would finally fold your spine into something manageable. But they didn't anticipate the geometry of your stillness. They prepared for a fracture. What they encountered was a recalibration. Because the thing that doesn't just disappoint them, it terrifies them, is watching you stop fighting for their version of reality and start building your own. You know the exact frequency of that exhaustion. It doesn't live in your muscles. It lives in the space between your ribs, right where your nervous system learned to brace for impact. You spent years translating their volatility into something your mind could justify. You mapped their contradictions. You memorized the subtle shifts in tone that preceded the withdrawal. You carried the unspoken rulebook of a dynamic where your boundaries were treated as suggestions and your patience was treated as currency. You replayed conversations in the dark, dissecting your own syntax, wondering if you had simply failed to find the correct sequence of words to make them see you. But you finally realized the debate was never about clarity. It was about occupancy. They needed you loud enough to prove their control worked, quiet enough to prove it didn't. And you stopped providing either metric. 1. The anatomy of manufactured collapse. Let's name the architecture of what you've survived. You were placed under a slow, invisible pressurization. Not the kind that announces itself with violence, but the kind that operates through gradual compression. They normalized the unreasonable. They pathologized your clarity. They taught your nervous system to interpret constant friction as the baseline for connection. You felt it in the way your own voice began to thin out, in the way you started editing your instincts before they even formed. This isn't weakness. This is what happens when a human system is forced to run on corrupted data. You weren't breaking. You were adapting to a hostile environment by learning to make yourself smaller. The exhaustion you carry is the metabolic cost of holding two realities at once, the one you actually experienced and the one they insisted was true. You kept waiting for a moment of mutual recognition. Instead, you got gaslighting disguised as concern, criticism disguised as correction, and you internalized it all, mistaking survival for failure. But the body keeps a ledger. The mind tracks every dismissed boundary, every minimized hurt, every time your truth was treated as a negotiation. You didn't collapse under the weight. You learned how to stand upright beneath it. And that is the first fracture in their entire design. They built a system dependent on your eventual surrender. What they didn't calculate is what happens when the surrender is replaced by surgical observation. 2. The fracture in the expected script. What they missed wasn't your distance. It was the decoupling of your stimulus-response cycle. Every toxic dynamic runs on a predictable algorithm: provocation, reaction, escalation, resolution, reset. They authored the script, and they cast you as the primary counterweight. Your anger proved their importance. Your confusion proved their superiority. Your pleading proved their leverage. They expected the familiar choreography. But you didn't just stop dancing. You stepped out of the theater and closed the doors from the outside. That's what they couldn't compute. When you removed your voice from the equation, you didn't leave a vacuum. You left a mirror. And mirrors are terrifying to anyone whose identity is constructed on distortion. They prepared for your breakdown. They didn't prepare for your calibration. Because a breakdown is temporary. It can be managed. It can be used as proof of your instability, your need for guidance, your dependency. But a calibrated exit is permanent. It removes the feedback loop entirely. You stopped reacting to the bait. You stopped defending against the phantom accusations. You stopped trying to translate your worth into a language they're structurally incapable of speaking. They thought your quiet was the calm before your eventual collapse. What they didn't realize is that it was the sound of a system finally shutting down a corrupted program. You aren't withholding your reaction to punish them. You're preserving your architecture. And that distinction is what keeps them awake at night. 3. The neurology of unfed anticipation. Let's dissect the machinery beneath the panic. The human ego is not sustained by truth. It is sustained by attention. Specifically, reactive attention. Every time you argued, defended, or explained, you were feeding a dopamine-dependent circuit in their nervous system. Even negative attention registers as validation. It confirms their gravity. It proves they can still influence your internal state. Intermittent reinforcement was the engine. They gave just enough ambiguity to keep you chasing, just enough withdrawal to keep you doubting yourself, just enough intensity to keep you hooked on the hope of a resolution that would never materialize. But silence is the neurological equivalent of a severed wire. When the anticipated response fails to trigger, the prediction engine misfires. The limbic system interprets unmet expectation as threat, and the ego, stripped of its usual fuel source, begins to consume its own certainty. Watch the mechanics unfold. First comes the projection. They will narrativize your absence as cruelty, arrogance, or a temporary malfunction. Then comes the escalation. They'll test the perimeter with subtle provocations, manufactured urgency, or sudden, unearned vulnerability. These are not attempts at connection. They are diagnostic pings. They are scanning the darkness to see if the old wiring still conducts. But you've already rerouted the current. You're no longer broadcasting on their frequency. And when a control system can no longer measure its own impact, it doesn't just malfunction. It panics. The terror isn't in what you're doing. It's in what you've stopped doing. You removed the validation loop. And an unvalidated ego cannot sustain its own illusion of power. 4. The architecture of unanswered gravity. This is where the invisible toll compounds. You assume absence equals peace. For them, it equals exposure. Without your arguments to deflect, without your explanations to dissect, they are forced into a room with no mirrors. No version of you to manipulate. No friction to prove their dominance. Just the unvarnished echo of their own patterns. And that architecture was never engineered to bear its own weight. You'll recognize the stress tests when they come. The sudden nostalgia wrapped in vague phrasing. The carefully timed messages that look like closure but function as hooks. The indirect remarks designed to pull a single emotional thread. But these aren't reconciliations. They're structural inspections. They're measuring the depth of your detachment. And with every ignored signal, the foundation they relied on begins to shear. Not because you retaliated, because you ceased participating. The quiet exit doesn't punish them with noise. It dismantles them with indifference. They will scramble to rewrite the history. They'll cast you as the unstable one, the cold one, the one who abandoned the dynamic without warning. But the narrative collapses under its own physics when there's no one left to play the antagonist. You are no longer a participant in their economy of control. You are a closed circuit. And a control system cannot operate in isolation. It will either adapt to your absence or implode trying to recreate it. 5. The sovereign calibration. And this is where you cross the threshold from survivor to architect. The quiet exit is not a retreat. It is a strategic reallocation of your cognitive, emotional, and physiological resources. You stop waiting for them to understand what they are structurally committed to misunderstanding. You begin treating your presence as a finite asset. Scarce. Non-refundable. Strategically deployed. The loudest argument only rearranges the furniture in a burning building. The quiet exit walks through the door, seals the threshold, and stops watching the smoke. You are rebuilding your attention span from the ground up. You're teaching your nervous system that peace is the default state, not the reward for surviving another round. You don't need their apology to validate your departure. You don't need their confusion to confirm your clarity. You simply observe the mechanics of what they are. You note the patterns without absorbing them. You let the friction exist without letting it enter your bloodstream. This is the anatomy of real power. Not dominance. Not retaliation. Just calibrated distance. You are no longer available for recruitment back into a war you already won by leaving it. Your energy is the territory, and you have finally learned to close the gates without announcing it. You hold the silence, and the silence holds the leverage. You didn't abandon the fight. You simply stopped funding it. Let them navigate the vacuum without your gravity. Let them learn the exact difference between being challenged and being irrelevant. Your attention is not a public utility. It is a sovereign vault. Guard the threshold. Withdraw the witness. Starve the pattern. Let them drown in the quiet.